welcome to Inside the Album. I'm Don Seckler. He's Tommy Hilkin. How you doing, Tom?
Doing great, Don. Nothing like being your Ed McMahon.
It's always good. Always good.
Always good.
Always good. So today we're going to do a deep dive and go inside the album, Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, Damn The Torpedoes. Part of what we're doing, this podcast is also working with a charity called Music for Mark. So let's talk about that a little bit, Tom.
Hey, thanks, Don, and I really look forward to it. You know, we use the word iconic almost every week now, but this album is just tremendous. And for me, it brings back such great memories. I have to tell you, great time in our lives, great music. But yes, our foundation, which we wrap around this, is called Music for Mark. And what it is we bring music to youth all around, especially in our local area. We bring music lessons as well as musical instruments to people who might need them. So it's much more than a podcast to us. We wrap it around our foundation, helping bring music to the world through kids. And, you know, what a great why. Why are we doing this? This is a great why for us. This is our purpose now, is to bring music to the world. And we're doing it through musicformark.com. Take a look, check it out. I think you'll like what you see.
Yeah, definitely stop by the website and check it out. And we're going to be doing a lot more with that as we roll along here and really hopefully grow it and make it into a great organization.
Beautiful.
So with Damn the Torpedoes, this is the third studio album by Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. And you see a lot of bands really kind of hit their stride on their third albums. I know that happened with Aerosmith with Toys in the Attic and a bunch of others. And that's what happened with Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. They had, before this, they had a couple of albums where they had American Girl and Breakdown, some great songs, legendary songs that everybody knows. Yep. But this Damn the Torpedoes album, it really came together with a lot of classic songs that are just rock and roll standards at this point.
So what do you think when it comes down to it? Why third album? You know, and my thoughts on that one, you know, not only are you getting better at what you're doing, right? You know, performing, songwriting, sure. But I'm sure we're going to discuss as we go along, you start to attract different people into your life who can help you be better. And you'll notice that.
Yeah, I think it's a combination of those things. I really do think the live playing really helps bands just get better. The more, it's like anything, the more you do it, the better you get at it. Yeah. You know, you get into a zone where you really have some success, and then you start to layer on that and say, okay, this is what works for us. And it's going to be different with every band, but they start to realize this is kind of our pocket where we fit and where we're in that kind of groove. We talk about that with the songs, but I think it's also for a career for a band too. You get into that pocket where you're like, wow, we're doing great stuff over and over again. It's not the same every time, but you get in that pocket where you've had that experience of continued success, which is great.
Yeah, I like what you said. You get to the point where you say, you know, this is where we are. This is who we are as a band. Yeah. Right. Where everybody finally starts to come together, which is a pretty cool way of looking at it. And the more you play together, you get to learn each other. Yeah, this is how it grows. I love it.
Right. So the Heartbreakers, we'll run down the members of the band. Obviously, it's Tom Petty as the front man and the kind of the lead songwriter. Also in the band is guitarist Mike Campbell, who had played with Petty previously in his previous band, keyboardist Belmont Tench, drummer Stan Lynch, and also bassist Ron Blair. So, you know, these guys all contribute in different ways. And, you know, we've got some interesting stories, especially about Stan Lynch, who I think is really underrated as a really good drummer. But we'll talk about him in a little bit. The album came out in October of 1979. So again, we're back in the late 70s. You know, kind of the landscape for that year at the time. Billy Joel 52nd Street was a huge album at the time. You know, rock and roll, but kind of more middle of the road. You know, not as kind of grungy and dirty as Tom Petty is. A little swampy. He's a Southern boy, and you know they got a little bit of that swagger to them. You also had Breakfast in America from Supertramp, a huge album at that time. I remember back then you couldn't turn on the radio without hearing Supertramp. Again, a little bit more of a middle of the road, right? Band.
Yeah. You know, as far as rock and roll goes, like in it, Billy Joel, Supertramp, more poppy than,
Right.
I don't, to all my Billy Joel fans out there, I'm sorry I used the word poppy, but we'll go with that.
No, but I think that's an accurate description. There was also the first Van Halen album, which was heavy and loud. So a little bit different, people could almost call it metal. I wouldn't really put Van Halen in metal personally, but,
right.
And then there was Cheap Trick at Budokan, which for me personally at that time, that was a huge album as a kid. That was something I listened to over and over and over again. Just a huge, even though it was a live album, it really showcased that band's skills. They came alive. It was so much better than the studio versions of those songs.
Put them on the map.
Yeah, exactly. So, and at the time there was a lot of disco still, and there was the new wave and punk were just coming around. So there was all this stuff going on around them, and Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers were just a rock and roll band, and they stayed right in that lane. They weren't playing to the times. They were, their sound didn't change much from album to album. They just went ahead and played. And, I think that's where you see that it kind of differentiated them, even though they weren't keeping up with the times, so to speak.
Well, literally, as I mentioned earlier to you before we got on, this was a tremendous and a different time in music when you think about it. You just mentioned everything, right? Some of the biggest, the English bands were still huge. Clapton was huge. The Stones were huge. And Tom Petty trying to find his way in where he is as an American band, right? And Joe Jackson was coming around. And like you had mentioned, punk was still alive more than ever.
Right.
But right now at that time, you got to start thinking about new wave. So everybody's going in this new direction. And here Tom Petty is staying true to being a rock and roller.
Right. And that where you hear the biggest difference is all those new wave bands using lots of synthesizers. Tom Petty, Belmont Tench, a lot of B3 Hammond organ, so old school sound with the keyboards. And they didn't get into that whole kind of synth sound that was happening with some of the new wave bands. Yeah,
overproduced albums.
A little bit. Yeah, I always thought that the new wave stuff I always thought was very produced. And I think again Tom Petty is just a straight ahead rock. So the album sold almost 3 million copies, which was a pretty good number at the time. The band was pretty solid as a unit, which was great. So I think, again, you come back to this third album, they're tight and the sound is there. They're really, really on point with this album.
Oh, I was just going to say with this album here, where they were, they didn't really know where they were. Tom Petty, I remember reading something in Rolling Stone one time that, this was, I don't know how to even put this, but I'll put it out there. This was a stoner band. I mean, they literally loved, Tom Petty said, all they would do was get together, get stoned, and play music.
Right.
Now, I'm not saying anything out of school. So this is where they were really discovering they never wanted to change, but go ahead.
Right. Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, and it was just kind of, it was just straight ahead rock and roll, and stoner was part of that at this time. So, they got some really good reviews on this. People were saying that this was like the height of their songwriting. I don't think that was actually, I mean, you can't foresee the future because the album Wildflowers in 1994, I think that's the peak of Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. But still this was a very well received album by the press at the time.
It was big. The pain that went into this album. And I have to tell you, you can see it in some of the songs. Tom Petty was pissed off when he made this album.
There is a lot of anger in it. Yeah. And you definitely will see that in some of the songs. The interesting thing, and this, and this album again was hugely popular at the time, but it only got to number 2 on the Billboard chart, stayed there for 7 weeks, and was kept out of the top spot by Pink Floyd's The Wall, which just really dominated 1979, 1980.
You hit a wall.
Yeah, you hit a wall, right? So, and the wall is a double album with hit after hit after hit. Well, high hit, but great rock songs. So it was really hard. I remember there was a kid in my high school, and he literally would walk around carrying his copy of The Wall in, in the hallways. So
The cool kids, come on.
yeah, it was something that was
Look,
very
man.
strong competition for them. Completely different type of music.
Oh,
But the interesting thing is Tom Petty said, "Hey, I love Pink Floyd, but I hated them that year."
oh yeah, I love that. Yeah.
So they kept him off the top of the charts.
Yeah.
But it did go to #1 in New Zealand. So
Ah.
the Kiwis know their shit.
Yeah, they probably had enough of Pink Floyd.
Exactly.
The Kiwis.
So a lot of great songs on this album. Classic rock and roll. Don't Do Me Like That. Refugee, Here Comes My Girl, Even the Losers. And again, we talked about last week, we talked about the Rolling Stones album where it was almost a greatest hits album. And this, again, you've got, again, 5 songs that are really strong songs and top of their catalog. So
yeah, I always mention to you that the best part about you and I getting together and doing Inside the Album is getting inside the album. Right. So
getting to listen to them, right? Over and over again.
Over and over. But I got to mention the song because like we did last week with the Stones, the songs that most people don't hear are just so killer. And there's a song on this album called Louisiana Rain.
Love it.
Yeah. Just to me, it's like the song that should have been, but it just didn't. Just a great song.
Yeah, definitely. I love Louisiana Rain. And interesting thing about that song, they didn't have it in their live set list for a long time. And then in the 2000s, they started bringing it back again and people loved it. And it's kind of a little bit more mellow song. We'll go into it a little bit more as we get into the specific songs. But, again, a great record.
Yes.
So when they were recording this, they hired Patti Smith's engineer. That was because they loved Because the Night and the big sound that they got out of that. Plus, Jimmy Iovine was the producer on Damn the Torpedoes and also on the Patti Smith record as well.
Mm-hmm.
So Jimmy Iovine had started out as an engineer in New York, had done some work with Springsteen, and then went to Patti Smith and worked on that album. And Because the Night is a Springsteen song. And so these guys, Jimmy Iovine and the engineer that they hired, had worked together, and they brought them in because they loved that sound on that Patti Smith record. And, Patti Smith is a lot different than Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, but they realized that was the kind of sound they wanted to get big and be really kind of, not in your face, but, around you kind of is how I would describe it.
And Petty got a lot from it was Jimmy Iovine worked on Born to Run.
Yeah.
So when working on Born to Run, now Petty said it wasn't his type of music, but it was how it was put together in the studio.
Right. Exactly.
That made, you got to realize Born to Run, and we're talking about an album that made Springsteen explode. Right. So what went off in Petty's head was, I need that kind of action that's going to make us explode.
Yeah. And he loved the sound. He loved, so when you get into the real detail of the sound of the recordings and how they were done, you can make a big difference just from switching out microphones and using different instruments and things like that. So having somebody with that expertise is really valuable on a record.
Tom Petty loved Jimmy Iovine. He brought him a couple samples of what they were going to be playing, and he said Jimmy Iovine looked at him and said, "Guess what, fellas? We're going to be millionaires."
Nice.
Yeah, because he knew he had something. He was around rock and roll.
Oh yeah,
So it's not a feeling. He looked at them and said, "Guess what, fellas?" And that's why Tom Petty loved them.
Yeah, and the thing was, so Iovine really was kind of just starting out at this point. I mean, he wasn't like what he is now. But so when you hear that from this guy who's, he's got some experience, but not a ton, you wonder, does Tom Petty really buy into that? I think he did.
Yeah, he did. Yeah, he did.
So the other interesting fact about this album was, so Tom Petty is always, his whole career, battled record companies. And so they had a deal with one company. It got bought out by MCA. Yeah. He didn't like that because he didn't have anything to do with it. So he, fought against them and ended up just declaring bankruptcy to get out of the record deal.
So great story. Yep.
his attitude with the record companies was they're going to play dirty. I'm going to play dirty. Tom Petty for a 120-pound guy, a skinny guy, he was pretty ballsy, and didn't take shit from anybody really.
Yeah. The phrase he said that he noticed about people in rock and roll, Tom Petty, and why they didn't want to be. And I kind of like it when I read the story about him and all the things I learned about Tom Petty. He literally didn't want to be bought and sold by a record company, because you look through the years, not only did the record company, they owned you, they owned your music, they owned everything.
Yeah.
So he was like, he was one of the first guys to step up and say something has to happen here.
Right.
And he took everything, like you said, he went as far as bankruptcy.
Oh, yeah.
Say, like, I got nothing for you.
And it didn't stop there. Even on, I think it was Hard Promises, he threatened to change the name of the album to, I forget what the price was at the time. It was like $9.99, and they wanted to increase it to $12.
Yeah.
And he was going to name the album, I think it was $9.99 or whatever that price was. I don't know the exact number. But he was basically saying, screw you. You're not going to, screw over my fans just so you can make more money. I'm in control here. This is my thing. So It's good to see somebody who stands up for that, because it can be scary when you're a musician. You feel like, oh, I'm lucky I got a record contract. They're giving me a chance to be a rock star. But in reality, they're nothing without your talent. So,
yeah, that's the whole thing, and I'm glad he did what he did. They said during the sessions that they would start to record him, and then they started to think that they felt uncomfortable that he actually had somebody hide the recordings, which was literally take them and hide them.
Hide the papers.
That's how bad they felt recording for this company. Think about that. You're looking over your shoulder saying, where's my career? This is my band, for God's sakes.
Right.
So he started to hide everything from the company, which is pretty interesting.
Crazy.
Way to look. Crazy.
So the album also was, it was also on Rolling Stone magazine's list of the 500 greatest albums. It was released in 2003. So that's pretty impressive. And like we said before, there were some already popular songs. They had Breakdown and American Girl from their first album, and then I Need to Know, which is another huge hit that was on the second album.
Yeah.
So they really came into this recording with a lot of momentum.
Yeah. When I grew up, listen to me, when the old guy here, FM radio was huge. WNEW in New York, was huge.
Right.
And the whole breakthrough was to getting a song played. If you got Scott Muni back in the day to play a song for you, that was huge. So FM radio was huge. So these songs were strictly, and I mean that, they were built for FM radio. They really were. They knew what they were doing to get them on FM radio.
Yeah, definitely. And, even though you could say, okay, well, it's kind of not a system, but I don't know. It's not like a template. Like it wasn't like just fill in the blanks.
No.
Even though it was radio friendly, it was just great music. So it wasn't like, they were like just painting by numbers, but it just fit with what was going on and what people were into at the time.
There was no other place to go. I mean, when you think you had to get on FM radio. So that's the difference between what we're talking about now and where you can release your music any way you want, one song at a time.
Yeah.
Right.
So
these guys had to release albums.
Yeah, exactly. It wasn't right. Nowadays, everything's loosey goosey. Songs come out, EPs, all that stuff. It was just always albums back then.
Had to.
So kind of back to Jimmy Iovine. So there was a little bit of stress between Iovine and Stan Lynch, because Iovine was trying to get this sound that he had in his head for the drums. So he's in there switching out mics, switching out drums, and it just created a lot of tension with Stan Lynch at points where he would like storm out. And I totally get that, because this guy's a drummer. He's a musician. Those drums are his instruments, and he knows what sound he wants to get. But there's the producer going in and changing his stuff. It's like saying, no, don't play that guitar, play this one over here. But I like this one. And he's like, well, no, you're going to play this drum, so that was part of the issue with Stan Lynch. I think he had a bit of a short fuse, I'm sure. And he's had some tension over the years with Tom Petty, but this really amplified that. So that made it a little bit challenging in the studio.
I heard somebody define them as an ornery band.
Yeah, and they always it's that swag. They always had that swagger, that southern. Hey, we don't care what you think. This is what we're gonna
Yep.
do.
Here's what we're playing.
Take it or leave it. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the songs. We'll start off with Refugee, which starts off the album. Just absolute all-time great song. This song, they ended up doing over 100 takes, which is crazy. And Mike Campbell actually got kind of pissed off when they were recording it because they had done it. They did 50 takes, then they did 80.
Yep.
And one time he's just walked out of the studio, and he said, I just can't do this anymore. It's painful. So he left town for a couple days and went to go clear his head out, and then came back, and they eventually found a take that was good, and they finished that one. But in the end, over 100 takes for one song. And again, this comes back to the producer. This is Jimmy Iovine, where he's got this perfection, and he's got this sound in his mind, and he wants to hear that. So he, forces guys to go through and do it over and over and over again.
I want to share something as a performer, as an artist. The more and more you do it, the less and less it gets. And that's why a lot of the older bands would get together and record live.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Let's do this. Let's get this on tape. Let's jam. Let's record it. Right. But they were taking this album to a newer level. And I truly believe it comes back to getting that FM sound. I really do.
Well, I think you lose the spontaneity of it, Right. So, and there's a lot to be said for that. Especially with rock and roll, you don't want to put it in a box and lock it down into it should be A, B, or C. These guys, again, are super creative musicians, and they're going with it. But after a while, it just wears off, and now you're just playing a song that doesn't really matter to you anymore, I think, sometimes.
We've both seen some great rock and roll through the years, you and I. There's rock and roll, and then there's money-making rock and roll. And
Sure.
It has to be, if you're going to be a band who tours and gets out there and wants to make not just a living, but, killing it as an artist out there.
Right.
There's money making rock and roll, unfortunately.
Right. And you can tell, you can tell when they're just up there going through the motions, and, they're doing their stage act, and everything's the same night after night after night. Yep. There are very few bands that really do a lot of changing up of their set lists and things like that and play different songs. It's very rare to see a band that will go on tour and you can go see them in 5 different places and see 5 different set lists.
Yeah.
And I don't think they really did that, but there are a couple of bands that do that these days.
A lot of bands realize and think about it. For them to continue doing what they're doing, they got to play the greatest hits. We've seen some of the greats. We've seen probably all the greats, and they all have to get their hits out there. It's like, you're not going to go see Clapton and leave without hearing Layla. It's how rock and roll is and what people want to hear. So you give the people what they want.
All right. So here, I'm going to give you, this is a crazy connection. Okay. So there's a connection to Refugee that is Mick Taylor from the Stones. So Mike Campbell was, listening, and it was a dark sound that the sound of Refugee is kind of a dark, dangerous sound, right? It's got that edge. The video, they show them, in an alley, and very, it's very 80s if you see it.
Yeah, there you go.
But so Mike Campbell is listening to John Mayall's version of "Oh Pretty Woman," which at the time featured a very young, before he was in the Rolling Stones, Mick Taylor. And it was Mick Taylor's playing that was a real influence and inspiration for what Mike Campbell plays on Refugee. So, sometimes you get these connections, and they just happen from either listening or experiencing another player. And you're like, wow, that's interesting. And then, that becomes this song.
You mentioned Mike Campbell, and so we'll just throw it out here. When you make a list of guitar players, right, never comes to mind. Amazing guitar
he's
player.
A great player, but he's not, he's not an Eddie Van Halen or a Clapton or a Hendrix.
Yeah,
but he's an amazing musician. And those guys, the guys in the Heartbreakers have continued to play with other bands and other people and support them
Oh,
since Tom Petty died. So
yeah.
they're still active out there. The interesting thing is, though, that Campbell, when he came in with the demos for Refugee, he played it for Tom Petty, and Tom Petty wrote the lyrics in 10 minutes.
Yeah.
So it was, again, one of those songs that just came together quickly, flowed out of them. It was meant to be, and, it happened.
Kind of one. I'm just thinking, is it their signature song? Or is American Girl their signature song?
I think you could say either one, and the interesting thing is that Mike Campbell also said that Refugee or American Girl, it's everything they do gets compared to those two songs. So he said it's an albatross, it's kind of a tough thing to deal with, but on the other hand, he said it's a great problem to have,
Yeah, I would say.
You've got these classic songs that everybody knows, and they compare everything you do to them.
And thank God, they set a standard, and that's it. You got to live up to your standards. But it keeps you fresh. It keeps you going. It keeps you writing great songs.
It does. I think it challenges you, so you really work because that you've got something, you've got a bar to get up to.
Yeah.
Jim Keltner came by one day and had a great idea for the track, and he added the samba shaker to the track. It's that, and it helped add a little bit of swing to it. So, without it, it sounded a little flat. And Stan Lynch wasn't there at the time. It might have been during one of the the unhappy minutes there. But Jim actually came in, and people say that it made a big difference in the end recording.
Yeah, Jim Keltner, man, there's a blast from the past.
Yeah. So let's talk about Here Comes My Girl, the next song on the album. Mike Campbell said it's very similar to Refugee. They were both written in the same week, and he had some demos that he was playing for Tom, and Tom liked those too. So Here Comes My Girl was interesting because he had the chorus, and Tom wasn't sure what to do with the verse. Kept trying to sing in different ways and wasn't happy with it. And he finally came across this kind of half-talking thing that he was doing, and that changed the song completely. So, it made it come to life, and I think it kind of balances out the kind of almost beautiful chorus of "Here Comes My Girl," but a lot of it is, "Hey, ta 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 ta," right? Right.
Yeah.
But again, you hear that kind of swagger, that Southern swagger comes through. But it's interesting how, they'll try and sing it, and then all of a sudden the answer is not singing.
Oh, you know what? You figure it out as you go. Hey, that sounds great. A lot of bands talk about that all the time. What happens when you're creating, right? That's where the challenge was of doing it 100 times. Doing it 100 times isn't creating. You know what I'm saying? It's doing it 100 times. Right. But when you just, it's like brainstorming, when that idea hits, boom, go with it. Man, that sounds great. I always think the one thing about the Beatles was they always did that. They got together and jammed, and magic happened. I believe that's where the magic happens all the time, right?
Yeah, for sure.
No matter when you're on stage or you play something a little differently and you hear it, what was that you did, and you have a discussion. I love that part about rock and roll, man. And for me, I want more of that.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So the other interesting thing is that when Mike Campbell was recording a lot of these demo tracks at home on a 4-track cassette recorder, which were new things at the time, not like today where they could just open up their MacBook, and my son did an album where he recorded all the parts himself, but it's all on the computer. He's playing the parts, but he records everything on the computer and then puts them together.
It's amazing.
So he has a simple 4-track recorder at home, and he records these things. And the demo for Here Comes My Girl had actually incorporated a drum loop from the intro to Walk This Way by Aerosmith.
Nice.
So again, he's kind of like leaning into other songs that he liked and kind of incorporating part of those. And that didn't make it to the, the final version of the song, but it's a bit of that, a bit of that kind of cooperation between other music and his music and inspiration.
Sampling before there was sampling. How about
that?
Yeah,
exactly. Right. Ahead of the curve. Yeah.
There you go. Nobody even knew about it. Right? Hey, we're going to take this. We're going to put it on our album. Well, even
Yeah.
George Harrison did that a couple times. But go
Oh
ahead.
yeah.
I digress.
So even the Losers, another great classic song, and the idea for this came around when Tom Petty went back to his hometown in Gainesville, Florida, and he reconnected with one of his old friends. So they went to another friend's party and took LSD. And this girl, Cindy, who was the object of Tom Petty's crush in junior high
Ah,
school years ago, was there at the party. So when he was in school, this girl didn't pay any attention to him, right? But he'd
there
gone
you
back,
go.
and now they've got a couple of records under their belt, and so he had a little fame. And so now, of course, Cindy wanted to talk to Tom Petty.
Sure.
So
Did I mention I was a rock star, Cindy?
yeah, exactly. So
It's great.
they end up hooking up, and he had this epiphany, and he's like, "Oh, great idea for a song." And then that relationship was just, limited to that one. It was a one night stand. They were all high on LSD. And so it was the impetus for him recording Even the Losers. He's the loser, he's the
Yeah.
underdog who got lucky sometimes. So you hear that a lot in Tom Petty songs. There's a lot of kind of underdog. They're always pulling for the underdog, that person who, may not be the obvious choice for what girls or success or whatever. But it's interesting that all came together, and then, they created this song out of it.
Most of this album has a lot to do with how Tom Petty was feeling about himself. And, I said earlier, he had a lot of pain with this album because of the record deal and what was
Yeah.
going on with that. So
Yeah, for sure.
he was literally taking that anger to the studio and didn't
Yeah.
want to hear anything from anybody. Here's how we're doing it. And listen, it's a gem. It worked out perfectly.
So did you ever notice at the beginning of Even the Losers, there's a woman's voice that says, "It's just the normal noises in here." Did you ever hear that? It's very faint in the background, but when you start it up, you hear that.
Oh, yeah.
And what that is that's the voice of Mike Campbell's wife. He was doing a demo recording at the time, and it was in his house, and he was apparently complaining to her about the noise that the washing machine was making. And so what she said was, "Hey, it's just the normal noises in here. Like, get off my back." But they loved that, so they kept it they put it on the beginning of the song.
That's great. Little tidbit for you folks.
Yeah.
All right. And now I got to listen to it. I didn't hear it.
So Campbell also, or they said that they had the tune for the chorus, and they had the chords, and they went ahead to cut the song, but they had no idea what Tom was going to sing when he got to that point when the chorus came up. So he had the tune for it, but they didn't actually have the words, and he just, like divine intervention, Tom said, it just came out. Even the losers get lucky sometimes. So it wasn't even like even after all that, the thing with Cindy and the hookup and everything, it wasn't that clear as to what that song was going to be until he actually started playing it, and they started recording it. So
Yeah.
sometimes those things just flow and come out of them, and that's awesome to hear when it's such a great, happy surprise.
And you think about it, right? It's just an idea. It comes to play. What do you think about this? And that, again, bringing it back to Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, the one thing for sure is all the controversy they had recording this album was somebody was trying to put them and bring them together and keep them together, playing different parts. And they looked up and just said, no, here's how we do it. We play together. We play together as a band. Right. So a lot of this was going on when they were recording.
Yeah. And, you can really, I love when bands do record live and play and record together, because it's such a better feel, I think.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about Shadow of a Doubt, which is really, I think, kind of the first rocker, which it's got that swagger we've been talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And it really picks up the pace, and it gives you that full throttle rock sound. Because Refugee is kind of mid-tempo. Here Comes My Girl is a little laid back. Even The Losers isn't really kind of boom, 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 boom. It's very bum, 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 and Shadow of a Doubt comes out and just bam, smacks you in the face. And it's one of those songs that over the years they become like their swagger song on stage, where they really plow through it, and really it's a real rocker.
Yeah, get the crowd turned on, and everybody's got to have one, and this
Oh
is it.
yeah.
Oh
Yeah, for
yeah.
sure. How about Century City? So this song was inspired by the legal battle, which we've been talking about with MCA. And so when the Heartbreakers went to Los Angeles, like right away they realized they loved LA. They became an LA band, even though they're all from Florida, or most of them are from
Funny.
Florida. So you think, okay, these are, I wouldn't say hillbillies, but they were pretty, Southern boys, So to go and embrace Los Angeles like that, I think is a big change. But Century City is the place in Los Angeles where it's a lot of sleek law offices and big buildings. And so it's like an acre of skyscrapers, really. And it's very modern, or was very modern looking at the time. And again, it's all these lawyer offices. And Tom Petty said, they take you up in these big glass conference rooms, and he just hated being there. So, again, another song with that swagger about something they really are not happy with.
Yeah, their uncomfortability, it really showed a lot in what they did and how they did things throughout their whole career. When you think about it, Tom Petty has always stayed Tom Petty. No matter where you put him, no matter where you go, there you are. He was that kind of a guy. You had the Eagles out there in Los Angeles, a lot of California bands back then,
Right.
And they just literally, like you said, they stuck out, which wasn't the worst of things, but they also didn't fit in, which is
but it actually, and again, it comes back to that underdog fighting against the system kind of thing, so it really, again, gives them that swagger and that drive to those songs that really kind of rock out, like Century City.
Yeah. I was going to ask you, when it comes to Tom Petty, and we were discussing this, do you think of Tom Petty when you think of like this album we're covering, tremendous, iconic album? But I said to you, did Tom Petty make it to the point, Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, as an iconic band? Right? We're covering the album, but I wanted to share that with you and throw that around a little bit.
Yeah, for me personally, they are. I just love them. I mean, this is a band that had hit records in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and even 2000s. The albums they released were still great albums. They weren't, things have changed now, so you don't get as many radio hits for rock music, but the songwriting was still as good as it ever was. So for me, they are. But are they the Rolling Stones, the Beatles, Led Zeppelin, those types of bands? No.
Right.
But I think they're on the level right below that. But it's kind of tough to rank bands. I've never been a huge fan of that.
There's a show, because you just made me smile, because I'm thinking, imagine the level, right? The second tier, and how would you fit in there? But you know how many great bands are in there. You could just start right off. T-Rex.
It's right. I mean, there's so many bands that were so great that don't have the volume of, T-Rex has a bunch of popular pop songs or rock pop songs, but they're not, they're not the Beatles or something like that.
No.
But again, that's where, like, with these awards and like the Grammys and all those things, Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, I'm not super into those things, because I don't think it's a competition. It's like, if you love Tom Petty, that's great. Enjoy him. He doesn't have to be the best band of all time or the greatest of all time. I think there's a lot of value in just, enjoying the music,
The whole thing is, if they're enjoying the music and we're enjoying the music, it's a home run. Right. Oh, yeah. And I mean that literally. If what they're doing is giving them the spirit that they need and delivering it, and it shows. But you know what? We're going to leave the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame right here with this. The Doobie Brothers, it took them how many years? So that says it all.
Right.
We'll leave it at that.
All right. So, and the interesting thing is too, when you go see band, and I still go to see a lot of bands in clubs live. And to me, like the big bands, sometimes their live performances, while they're usually good, sometimes they're going through the motions. When you go to see these younger bands in the clubs and, Webster Hall in New York City or Irving Plaza, places like that, where it's, 1,000, 2,000 people tops, the energy is so different because they're really, you get a vibe and people are really so close that they can see and hear the crowd. It makes a big difference for me personally.
Oh, me too. You know what? Listen, you and I have been in every type of stadium and, you know, whatever it might be. We've been in every venue that can possibly be for a concert.
Yeah, for sure.
So the best of the best.
So let's talk about Don't Do Me Like That. So this song, again, another great song. Tom Petty originally wanted to give this song to Jay Giles' band.
That blows my mind, right? When you think about at that time who because the Jay Giles band progressed in all different ways, but think about who they were then. It was Centerfold, that was the Jay Giles Centerfold years, freeze frame years. So yeah, I love that you brought that up because to me, I found that so interesting. I was an early on Jay Giles fan, and then they started to go extremely.
They got very poppy with that album, with the Centerfold album.
They went MTV. They MTV'd on me.
Yeah.
They were.
Well, a lot of bands did that in the 80s. You saw that with Genesis. You saw that with Jay Giles. There's a bunch of them that went from being kind of just straight ahead rock bands to video bands. And that's what Jay Giles became. Yeah. Mostly because of girls in very little clothing, and those videos were a lot of fun and a little sexy, and the songs were super catchy.
Think about what we were saying. So it's an interesting, we're not in the business, we're not doing it out there, but when do you sell your soul? When do you not sell your soul? As Ozzy would say, we sold our soul for rock and roll,
right?
So, and he truly believed that sometimes, that what he did was he gave up everything he ever had to become Ozzy Osbourne. But it's the same thing. So we were talking about, you had to fight to get airplay on FM, which was huge. Right. And then when the 80s came, you had to have a video on MTV.
Right. I mean, and that, and people nowadays who weren't around in the 80s don't realize that MTV broke a lot of bands. Bands' careers were made by being on MTV. So it was very influential. Yeah.
Huge, getting that video. Well, everybody was watching. It was new. It was hot. It was powerful. Right. So it went from getting on FM to getting on MTV, but it also made the music a little more that it had the song, had to hit the video, and the video had to meet the song.
A lot of times the song became secondary, and the song, as long as the song was kind of catchy and you had some sexy girls and a funny video, you were going to have a hit on MTV,
Yeah. And that's funny what you just said. Had a hit on MTV.
Yeah.
Wow. Right. So yeah, things changed, right? This is what we were saying, that in these years that we're talking about this album, a lot was going on. A lot of things were happening. Rock and roll was changing. It really was. So to get this album to where it got is a great, great look at how they really did this. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. The other thing about Don't Do Me Like That, when Tom wanted to give it to Jay Giles, Jimmy Iovine freaked out and said, there's no way we're giving this song away. It's too good. So, Jimmy Iovine, he knows his stuff. He really, really is a good judge of great songs. That song was also the first single off the album and also their first top 10 hit, which is interesting.
Now, I'll share something on a personal point of view. Always from Full House, the Jay Giles band, big fan, early Jay Giles, right? Mm-hmm. Right up to Love Stinks, loved it. Right. So to think about this, why it was such a fit, my favorite song is Don't Do Me Like That from Tom Petty. I love everything about it. And I didn't realize till I was going through all this stuff that, wow, and the one that they were giving it to the Jay Giles band, it probably would have been a perfect fit for them.
It was, right? Because it had that swing, a little bit of groove to it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And I get it. And it's exactly how Jay Giles played. So when you think about it, what a great song now. One of my favorites.
Yeah. So Tom actually wrote that song with Mudcrutch, his band before the Heartbreakers.
I love that.
In 1974. So it was a song that was around for a bit. Interesting thing about when they recorded it, they were using multiple mics on guitar amps. So usually you'll have one mic on a guitar amp, and if you don't like it, you'll change out, get a different mic. They were using 3 different mics on one amp, and so each microphone captures sound differently. So you're getting like slightly different sounds from each of these microphones, and they kind of use those and put them all together to create that unique sound that you hear on this song.
That's very cool.
Yeah.
Just the fact that each microphone records something completely different.
Oh yeah,
even if it's just off a little bit, it's great.
Right? Yeah, microphones make a huge difference in their sound. So let's talk about "You Tell Me." This song is kind of one of those underrated songs. I really like it a lot. Again, to me, this is like funky Tom Petty. You know, we talked last week about the funk, and
I just love when you get into the funk.
I love the funk, but it's kind of that laid back. You know, it's got that. It's almost like, hey, you're leaning back when you hear this. You're jogging around with it. So that song was actually the B-side for Louisiana Rain, which was released as a single as well. And it's not really a ballad, but it's definitely more laid back than, the rock songs on this record. But it's a personal favorite of mine. I love it.
Yeah, it's great. And, taking this back to the influences, Tom Petty has a tremendous respect for yesteryear. As a matter of fact, he loves the music of like the 1950s. So as much as he's a rock and roller, if you've ever listened to him, or if you listen to Tom Petty radio, the stuff he digs out that he says, here's something I love this. And you're like, wow, that's the most obscure song I ever heard.
Yeah.
But he was in love, not the 60s and the 70s that we know, the early 50s. That type of music really drove him to be who he became. And think about it. He is different than everybody else. And I think that's one of the challenges. When I said, is this an iconic band? I think their attitude and behavior kept them down a little bit of just being this rosy colored band. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I see what you mean. Like they could have leaned into it a little more, into the whole rock star thing, but they really never did. Right. They were just guys on stage with guitars and drums and keyboards.
It's all he ever wanted.
Yeah.
For real.
And I got to see him about a year before he died, and still an amazing performer.
Yeah.
And with the whole catalog, it was so impressive. It was just hit after hit after hit, and just a great show.
Dude, we've seen hundreds and hundreds of concerts. Truly, of all the most laid back rock and roll band I've ever seen live. Not that they're not tearing it up, but they're just like, hey, everybody. Hey.
Right. There's no dancing around, there's no, you don't see them smashing guitars or
coming out. How you doing?
Right. It's just hit it and go,
Yeah. Yeah. It's so good. I like that. I like this part of the conversation. The fact that, it was like just a comfortable place to go and listen to music, a Tom Petty concert. It really was.
Yeah.
Great.
So next up, there's "What Are You Doing in My Life?" And, not a lot to be said for this song from my point of view. It's another rock song. It's pretty up tempo and stuff.
Yep.
I don't think it's a bad song. I don't think it's the best song on the album, but it's something you're going to tap your foot to when you hear it.
Got a lot of airplay.
Yeah.
Again, these songs, this album, back in those days, I could just remember it and think about it. A lot of FM, got a lot of airplay.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And then the closer is Louisiana Rain, which really is the album's ballad. It's slow. It's kind of acoustic based. They started off with some weird noises. Then there's a keyboard part that comes in and fades out. And then the song really starts about 1 minute in when the acoustic guitar comes in, and it's a gorgeous song. And like I said before, they kind of, with the band, I guess it kind of fell out of favor for a while. They weren't playing it live, but then they started it again in the 2000s. People loved it, and they brought it back into their set.
It's the gem on the album.
It is. It's really the hit. It's kind of the hidden gem, right?
Yeah, to me, because like I said, we get to listen to this over and over, and I couldn't get enough of that. I really could.
Great,
and I'm a slide
song.
Guitar guy, and Tom Petty broke out the slide on that. So if I hear Slide, I'm hooked. It's a Johnny Winter thing, but
Yeah, the slide might be Mike, I would think, but it might be Tom. I'm not sure who played it on there.
Yeah, I think it was Petty played Slide on
okay.
it.
Okay.
Yep.
Interesting.
There you go.
So overall, this is, for me, Tom Petty is a all-time favorite band. I love this album. I give it A+ for sure. And it's something that I've enjoyed since the 70s.
Yeah, just to, from start to finish, put it on, listen to it. Can I give you a little something? I took a quote from I gave you. I want to. Are we going to wrap it up? We're getting to that point.
Yeah, we're almost ready to wrap it up.
Well, I want to give you a quote that I read from Rolling Stone.
Okay.
I thought it was so good, explaining Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. So it said, Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers made music that still befuddles critics, right? Get this. They were too chill to be punk and too famous to be underdogs.
Right.
Yeah. So I like too chill to be punk and too famous to be underdogs.
Right.
So in other words, they were playing the role of being the underdog. Their music was about but they got so famous that the role kind of didn't fit.
Yeah.
It's kind of an interesting way to look at it.
Well, and they, they're one of those bands that stayed in their pocket, which can be a little repetitive sometimes when you look at bands like an AC/DC or Motorhead. Those bands never change sound ever. It's always the same. Tom Petty's not like that in that extreme, but they're always in their zone. They're not doing it. You don't usually hear, there's some weird stuff they did in the 80s a little bit, but nothing too crazy. For the most part, they're a straight ahead rock and roll band.
They stay true to themselves.
Yeah, for sure.
Which is a beautiful thing.
All right. Well, that's it for Damn the Torpedoes. And don't forget, subscribe, listen on YouTube, where you can see our video on YouTube. You got your audio on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google, wherever you get podcasts. So it would help us out if you subscribe, and hope you enjoyed this episode, and we'll be back next week with another Inside the Album.
All right. See you, Don.